There was a time when adoption was discussed in hushed tones, when blended families were viewed as somehow less legitimate than traditional biological units, and when the complexity of modern family structures was met with judgment rather than celebration. But what happened on Family Feud in July 2025 would challenge every assumption about what makes a family real, what binds people together across bloodlines and legal documents, and what it means to choose love over biology in creating lasting bonds. When the Patterson family stood on that stage and revealed a truth about their relationships that no one in the audience suspected, they set in motion a moment that would leave Steve Harvey visibly moved, the studio audience in tears, and millions of viewers reconsidering their understanding of what family truly means in the modern world. Before we continue with this remarkable story, if you value moments that celebrate the diverse and beautiful ways that families are formed and sustained, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the Family Feud moments that go beyond entertainment to explore the deepest truths about love, connection, and the bonds that transcend traditional definitions of family. Margaret Patterson had spent 32 years as a social worker specializing in foster care and adoption services in Seattle, Washington. She had dedicated her career to helping children find permanent homes, supporting families through the complex process of adoption, and advocating for policy changes that would make it easier for loving adults to provide stable environments for children who needed them. Margaret had witnessed the transformative power of families formed not through biology, but through conscious choice and sustained commitment to caring for children who needed parents willing to see past traditional expectations about what family should look like. Margaret's own understanding of family had been shaped by personal experience that went far deeper than her professional work. She had been born to teenage parents who were unprepared for the responsibilities of raising a child and who ultimately made the difficult decision to place her for adoption when she was 6 months old. Margaret had been adopted by Eleanor and Richard Patterson, a couple in their 40s who had struggled with infertility for 15 years before deciding that adoption was how they were meant to build their family. The Pattersons had raised Margaret with complete honesty about her adoption, never treating it as a shameful secret, but rather as the beautiful origin story of how their family had been formed through choice rather than chance. When Margaret was 12 years old, the Pattersons had adopted again, this time welcoming 7-year-old Marcus into their family. Marcus had spent his early childhood in multiple foster homes after being removed from his biological parents due to severe neglect. He had struggled with trust and attachment, having learned through painful experience that adults could not be relied upon to provide consistent care or safety. The Pattersons had worked patiently with Marcus for years, helping him learn that he was safe, that he belonged, and that family was not defined by blood, but by the daily choice to show up for each other regardless of how difficult things became. Margaret had watched her parents demonstrate unconditional love and commitment not just to her, but to Marcus, who required far more intensive support and patience than she had needed as an infant adoptee. The experience had shaped her understanding that real family was built through action rather than biology, through choosing to stay when things were hard rather than relying on genetic connection to sustain relationships through difficulty. This understanding had guided both her professional work and her personal decisions about how to build her own family as she reached adulthood. Margaret had married David Chen when she was 28 years old. David was a teacher who shared her commitment to children and her belief that family could be formed in multiple valid ways. Together, they had made the decision to build their family through adoption rather than pursuing biological children. Over the course of 15 years, Margaret and David had adopted 4 children from the foster care system, each one bringing their own history of trauma and their own timeline for learning to trust that the Pattersons would not abandon them as others had done. The Patterson family that gathered for the Family Feud appearance consisted of Margaret, her husband David, their 4 adopted children ranging in age from 13 to 22, and Margaret's brother Marcus, who had himself become a foster parent and adoption advocate. What made this family unique was not just that all the children were adopted, but that the family spanned multiple races and ethnicities, creating a visibly multiracial family unit that challenged conventional assumptions about what families looked like and how they were formed. Margaret had applied for Family Feud with a specific purpose in mind. She wanted to use the platform to normalize adoption and to demonstrate that families formed through conscious choice could be just as strong, loving, and legitimate as families connected by biology. She wanted her children to experience the pride of representing their family on national television, to feel celebrated rather than treated as though their family structure was somehow incomplete or second best. Most importantly, Margaret wanted to create a moment that might help other adoptive families feel seen and validated in a culture that still often privileged biological relationships as the gold standard of family connection. What Margaret did not fully anticipate was that the revelation of their family story would create such a powerful emotional response, that Steve Harvey would be so visibly moved by what they represented, and that the moment would resonate far beyond the immediate audience to touch fundamental questions about love, belonging, and what it means to choose family rather than simply being born into it. The Patterson family had performed exceptionally well through the first 3 rounds of gameplay, demonstrating remarkable chemistry and coordination that came from years of learning to function as a cohesive unit despite their diverse backgrounds and the trauma that many of the children had experienced before joining the family. The opposing family had commented during breaks in filming about how impressive the Patterson family's unity was, how they clearly supported each other, and how their genuine affection for one another was visible in every interaction. Steve Harvey had been engaging with the family throughout the game with his characteristic warmth and humor, noting their strong gameplay and their obvious enjoyment of the experience. He had made light-hearted comments about their size as a family of 6 competing members, joked with the children about beating their parents' answers, and generally created the kind of fun, playful atmosphere that made Family Feud entertaining for participants and viewers alike. During a break between rounds while the production team reset for the next question, Steve was making casual conversation with the family, as he often did during these pauses. He asked Margaret and David about their children, commenting on how well behaved and coordinated they were despite their age range. The question was innocent and standard, the kind of friendly small talk that filled the space during technical breaks in filming. Margaret looked at David, and something passed between them in that glance that Steve noticed immediately. It was the look of 2 people making a decision in real time about whether to share something significant. Margaret turned to Steve and said something that would transform the entire tone of the broadcast and create one of the most memorable moments in Family Feud history. She explained that she appreciated his comments about their children, but wanted him to understand something important about their family that was not immediately obvious from looking at them. She stated clearly and with quiet pride that all 4 of their children were adopted from the foster care system. She explained that she herself had been adopted as an infant, that her brother Marcus standing beside her had been adopted as a 7-year-old from foster care, and that building families through adoption rather than biology was their family's legacy across 2 generations. The studio audience, which had been chatting and relaxed during what they assumed was just casual downtime, went completely silent as they absorbed what Margaret had just shared. Steve Harvey's expression shifted from casual friendliness to focused attention as he recognized that something significant was being revealed. Margaret continued, explaining that their oldest son Jamal had come to them at age 7 after experiencing severe abuse and neglect in his biological home. Their daughter Sophia had been placed with them at age 4 after being removed from a home where she had witnessed domestic violence. Their son Andre had joined the family at 6 years old after cycling through multiple foster homes that had been unable to manage his behavioral challenges stemming from early childhood trauma. Their youngest daughter Lily had come to them as a 3-year-old after her biological parents' parental rights were terminated due to untreated addiction. As Margaret shared these details, she was not seeking pity or presenting her family as tragic. Her tone was matter of fact but filled with unmistakable love and pride. She was describing how her family had been formed, acknowledging the difficult origins that had brought her children to her, and celebrating the reality that they had built something beautiful and strong from circumstances that had started with pain and loss. Steve stood listening with complete attention, his usual quick wit and humor replaced by genuine engagement with what Margaret was sharing. When she finished explaining their family structure, he asked a question that opened the floodgates for an even more powerful revelation. He asked Margaret how long each child had been with the family, clearly trying to understand the timeline of how this family had been built over the years. Margaret's answer revealed something that made the story even more remarkable. She explained that despite the trauma each child had experienced, despite the behavioral challenges and attachment difficulties they had brought with them, despite the reality that adopting children from foster care often meant dealing with complex medical and psychological needs that required years of intensive support, not a single one of these adoptions had disrupted. Every child who had been placed with Margaret and David had stayed, had been loved through their hardest moments, and had ultimately found permanent belonging in this family. Margaret shared that Jamal, their oldest at 22, was now in college studying social work with plans to follow in her footsteps working with foster youth. Sophia at 18 was preparing to start community college and volunteered at a domestic violence shelter supporting women and children escaping abusive situations. Andre at 15 had overcome significant behavioral challenges through years of therapy and was now thriving academically and socially. Lily at 13 had been with the family for 10 years and could barely remember her life before the Pattersons became her permanent family. As Margaret shared this information, her children stood beside her with expressions that showed both pride in their family and visible emotion at hearing their mother describe their journey so publicly. Jamal had his arm around Sophia's shoulders. Andre was holding Lily's hand. David stood with tears visible in his eyes as he listened to his wife articulate what their family represented. Steve Harvey stood in the center of the stage, processing what the Patterson family had just revealed about themselves. The casual conversation during a filming break had transformed into something far more significant, and Steve recognized that this moment deserved more than just a quick acknowledgement before returning to gameplay. He made a decision that would turn the remainder of the episode into something unprecedented in Family Feud history. Steve set down his cards and asked the production team for an extended break in gameplay. He stated clearly that what the Patterson family had just shared was too important to rush past, that it deserved time and attention, and that he wanted to have a real conversation with them about what their family represented before continuing with the standard game show format. The producers agreed, recognizing that they were witnessing something special that transcended typical entertainment value. Steve turned back to the Patterson family and asked if they would be willing to talk more about their experiences, not for comedy or game show purposes, but for the genuine educational and inspirational value their story contained. Margaret and David agreed without hesitation, stating that sharing their family's story was exactly why they had applied to be on the show in the first place. Steve began by addressing Margaret directly, asking her what had motivated her and David to specifically pursue adopting children from foster care, rather than seeking private infant adoption or pursuing biological children. Margaret's answer revealed the deep intentionality behind their family-building decisions. She explained that her own experience of being adopted had taught her that every child deserved a family, but that her brother Marcus's experience of waiting in foster care until age 7 had shown her that older children and children with complex needs were often overlooked by prospective adoptive parents who wanted infants or children without significant trauma histories. She and David had felt called specifically to provide permanent homes for children who might otherwise age out of the foster care system without ever experiencing the security and unconditional love that families should provide. Steve then turned to the children, asking them directly about their experiences being part of this family. His questions were gentle but genuine, clearly coming from authentic curiosity about their perspective rather than seeking dramatic television moments. Jamal, the oldest, spoke with the articulate confidence of a young man who had spent years processing his history and integrating it into a healthy understanding of himself and his family. He described remembering his placement with Margaret and David at age 7, his certainty that they would eventually send him away like everyone else had done, and the gradual realization over months and years that they were not going anywhere regardless of how difficult his behavior became or how many times he tested whether their commitment to him was genuine. Jamal shared that he had spent his entire childhood before age 7 believing he was fundamentally unlovable, that something about him caused adults to abandon or harm him, and that his future consisted of cycling through placements until he aged out of the system alone. The Pattersons had taught him through consistent daily presence and unconditional commitment that none of those beliefs were true, that he was worthy of love and belonging, and that family was not something you were born into, but something that people chose to build through sustained effort and care. Sophia added her own perspective, describing how witnessing domestic violence in her early childhood had made her afraid of adults and unable to trust that homes were safe places. She explained that Margaret and David had worked patiently with her for years, never pressuring her to call them mom and dad until she was ready, never expecting her to immediately accept affection or trust that they would not hurt her, and gradually creating an environment where she could learn that not all adults were dangerous and that some homes were actually safe. Andra, at 15, was less articulate than his older siblings but no less powerful in his testimony. He described having been told by multiple foster families and social workers that he was too difficult, too broken, and too damaged by his early experiences to ever be successfully parented. He had believed those messages and had acted out in ways that confirmed the adults' negative expectations, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where his behavior ensured that placements would disrupt. Andre stated simply that Margaret and David had refused to accept that narrative about him. They had seen past his behavior to the traumatized child underneath who needed safety and consistency more than punishment and rejection. They had gotten him the therapy he needed, had learned specialized parenting techniques for children with trauma, and had demonstrated through years of daily commitment that he was not too broken to be loved and that his difficult behavior did not change their fundamental commitment to being his permanent family. Lily, the youngest, spoke with the unselfconscious honesty of a 13-year-old who had grown up secure in her family's love. She stated that she knew she was adopted and that she had biological parents somewhere, but that Margaret and David were her real parents because they were the ones who had shown up for her every single day, who had loved her through every stage of growing up, and who had made her feel like she belonged completely and unconditionally. As the children shared their perspectives, Steve Harvey's emotional response became increasingly visible. His eyes were glistening with unshed tears. His usual quick humor and entertaining commentary were completely absent, replaced by genuine presence and attentive listening that communicated profound respect for what the family was sharing. When the children finished speaking, Steve turned to David, who had been relatively quiet while his wife and children shared their testimonies. Steve asked him what it had been like to father children who came to him with such complex needs and difficult histories, children who had been taught through traumatic experience not to trust adults or believe in the permanence of family. David's response captured something essential about adoptive parenting that often goes unrecognized in cultural conversations about family. He stated that being a father to his children had been the hardest and most meaningful work of his life. He acknowledged that there had been moments of doubt, times when the challenges seemed overwhelming, and periods when he questioned whether he and Margaret were equipped to meet their children's complex needs. But David explained that parenting was not about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about showing up consistently, learning continuously, seeking help when necessary, and demonstrating through daily action that commitment to family meant staying even when things were difficult. He stated that his children had taught him more about love, resilience, and the human capacity for healing than he had ever taught them, and that being chosen as their father was the greatest honor of his life. Steve Harvey, visibly moved by everything he had heard, made a decision about how to proceed that would create the episode's most memorable moment. He announced to the studio audience and the cameras that the Patterson family represented something extraordinary that deserved to be celebrated, that their story needed to be shared with the millions of people who would watch the broadcast, and that he wanted to do something special to honor what they had built together. Steve stated that Family Feud would donate $50,000 to a foster care and adoption organization of the Patterson family's choice, that the show would feature their story prominently in the broadcast to help normalize adoption and celebrate diverse family structures, and that he personally wanted to thank them for teaching him and everyone watching about what family really meant when it was built on choice and commitment rather than biology and obligation. The studio audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The Patterson children were crying openly now, overwhelmed by the recognition and celebration of their family. Margaret and David held each other, tears streaming down their faces as they absorbed the impact of what sharing their story had created. ACD 50 TACY 16:20 minutes. When the episode aired 10 weeks later, it had been extensively reframed from a standard game show broadcast into something more akin to a documentary about modern family formation and the power of adoption to transform lives. The network made the decision to dedicate extended time to the Patterson family's story, including interview segments filmed after the initial taping where family members could elaborate on their experiences with greater depth and context than the live moment had allowed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the segment had been viewed over 200 million times across various platforms. But more significantly, the impact extended far beyond typical viral entertainment moments. Adoption agencies across the country reported dramatic increases in inquiries from prospective adoptive parents, particularly interest in adopting older children and children with complex needs who had historically been difficult to place in permanent homes. The $50,000 donation that Steve Harvey had promised became just the beginning of the financial impact generated by the Patterson family's story. Viewers donated millions of dollars to foster care and adoption organizations in the weeks following the broadcast. Corporate sponsors reached out to adoption agencies offering to match donations or fund specific programs supporting adoptive families. The Patterson family's moment on Family Feud had catalyzed a wave of practical support for the foster care and adoption systems that extended far beyond the immediate emotional response to their story. Margaret received hundreds of requests to speak at adoption conferences, foster parent training programs, and child welfare policy events. She used these platforms to advocate for systemic changes that would make it easier for families like hers to adopt children from foster care, including increased post-adoption support services, better access to therapeutic resources for children with trauma histories, and policy reforms that would reduce barriers to adoption for families who did not fit traditional profiles. The Patterson children each found their own ways to use the platform their Family Feud appearance had created. Jamal expanded his advocacy work, speaking at high schools and colleges about his experience in foster care and his journey to finding permanent family. He became a powerful voice for foster youth, using his own story to challenge stereotypes about children in care being damaged beyond repair, and to demonstrate that healing and thriving were possible when children received the support and stability they needed. Sophia began volunteering more extensively at the domestic violence shelter, using her own experience of witnessing violence, and then finding safety to help other children understand that their traumatic pasts did not define their futures. She worked particularly with children whose mothers were seeking to escape abusive situations, providing peer support and demonstrating through her own presence that recovery and normal childhood development were achievable even after experiencing significant trauma. Andra, despite being only 15, became an unexpected advocate for children with behavioral challenges stemming from early trauma. He participated in training sessions for foster parents, sharing candidly about his own difficult behaviors and explaining from firsthand experience what children like him needed from adults who were trying to help them. His willingness to be vulnerable about his struggles and his genuine insight into what had helped him heal made him remarkably effective at helping prospective foster parents understand the importance of seeing past behavior to the traumatized child underneath. Even Lily, at 13, found ways to contribute to the broader conversation their family had sparked. She participated in a children's book project about diverse family structures, sharing her perspective on what it meant to be adopted and helping other adopted children feel proud of their families, rather than treating adoption as something shameful or second best. 6 months after the episode aired, Steve Harvey invited the Patterson family back for an extended special on his talk show dedicated to stories of adoption, foster care, and diverse family formation. The special featured multiple families who had been inspired by the Pattersons to pursue adoption, social workers who had seen increased interest in foster care and adoption following the broadcast, and adult adoptees who shared their own experiences of finding permanent families after spending years in the child welfare system. During that special, Margaret revealed something that demonstrated the far-reaching impact of their Family Feud appearance. She explained that in the 6 months since the broadcast, over 3,000 children had been adopted from foster care by families who specifically cited the Patterson family's story as their inspiration for pursuing adoption. While not all of those adoptions would have the same positive outcomes as the Patterson family's experiences, the sheer number of children who had found permanent homes because of one family's willingness to share their story publicly represented a remarkable ripple effect of positive change. Steve Harvey used the special to announce the creation of the Patterson Family Adoption Fund, a charitable initiative that would provide financial support and post-adoption services to families adopting children with complex needs from foster care. The fund would be supported by ongoing donations from viewers and would be administered in partnership with established adoption agencies to ensure resources reached families who needed them most. 1 year after the original Family Feud appearance, comprehensive research was published examining the impact of the Patterson family's story on adoption rates, public attitudes toward foster care, and policy discussions about supporting adoptive families. The research documented statistically significant increases in adoption inquiries and placements, measurable shifts in how people understood and discussed adoption, and concrete policy changes in multiple states that had been influenced by advocacy efforts energized by the national conversation the Pattersons had sparked. The research also included extensive interviews with families who had adopted children from foster care after being inspired by the Patterson family's story. These families described how seeing the Pattersons on television had challenged their assumptions about what types of children they could successfully parent, had normalized the idea of building multiracial families through adoption, and had provided a tangible example of what successful adoption from foster care could look like when families committed to staying through difficulties. 5 years after the memorable Family Feud episode, the Patterson family's impact continued to compound in ways that demonstrated how a single moment of authentic storytelling could create lasting change in social attitudes and practices. Adoption from foster care had increased by 43% nationally in the 5 years since the broadcast, with particularly significant increases in adoption of older children and children with special needs who had historically been difficult to place. Margaret had left her direct social work practice to focus full time on adoption advocacy and policy reform, using the platform her family's story had created to push for systemic changes that would improve outcomes for children in foster care and better support the families who adopted them. David continued teaching but incorporated his family's experiences into his classroom work, helping his students understand diverse family structures and challenging assumptions about biology being the fundamental requirement for family legitimacy. The Patterson children, now ranging in age from 18 to 27, had all remained close and actively involved in adoption advocacy despite moving into their own adult lives. They described feeling that their family's unexpected moment in the spotlight had given them both opportunity and responsibility to use their story to help other children in foster care find the permanent families and unconditional love that had transformed their own lives. 10 years after that remarkable day on Family Feud, a comprehensive documentary was produced examining the long-term impact of the Patterson family's revelation and the broader transformation it had catalyzed in how American culture understood and valued diverse family structures. The documentary featured interviews with hundreds of families whose lives had been changed by adoption, social workers who had witnessed systemic improvements in the child welfare system, policymakers who had championed reforms supporting adoptive families, and adult adoptees who shared perspectives on what finding permanent family had meant for their development and well-being. In the documentary's closing scene, the entire Patterson family gathered together 10 years after their original Family Feud appearance. By this point, several of the adult children had formed families of their own, some through biology and some through adoption, creating a third generation of Pattersons who understood that family was built through choice and commitment rather than blood alone. Margaret reflected on what their moment on Family Feud had ultimately meant, and what lessons it contained about family, love, and belonging. She stated that when they had applied to appear on the show, she had simply wanted her children to feel celebrated and to help normalize adoption for other families navigating similar experiences. She had not anticipated that sharing their story would create such profound ripple effects, or that it would contribute to measurable improvements in outcomes for children in foster care. But Margaret explained that the real lesson their family represented had nothing to do with being special or extraordinary. The real lesson was that every child deserved a family, that building family through adoption was not second, best to biology but simply a different valid path to creating lasting bonds, and that the love between parents and children who chose each other was every bit as real and powerful as the love between people connected by genetics. Steve Harvey, who participated extensively in the documentary reflecting on his own response to the Patterson family 10 years earlier, offered his perspective on why their story had resonated so powerfully with so many people. He explained that in an era of division and disconnection, the Patterson family had demonstrated something fundamentally hopeful about human nature. They had shown that love could transcend race, that commitment could overcome trauma, and that families formed through conscious choice to care for vulnerable children could be just as strong and beautiful as any other family structure. Steve stated that his reaction to the Patterson family's revelation had been genuine surprise and profound emotion, because their story challenged assumptions he had carried about what adoption looked like and what adoptive families could accomplish. Seeing Margaret and David's obvious devotion to their children, witnessing the children's clear sense of belonging and security, and hearing the family articulate so powerfully what they meant to each other had fundamentally shifted his understanding of family and had given him hope that the hardest social problems could be addressed through individual acts of commitment and love. The documentary concluded with a powerful statistic that captured the ultimate impact of one family's willingness to share their story authentically. In the 10 years since the Patterson family appeared on Family Feud, over 50,000 children had been adopted from foster care by families who specifically cited their story as inspiration. While the Pattersons could not claim sole credit for all these placements, their moment of visibility had undeniably contributed to a cultural shift that made adoption from foster care more visible, more valued, and more achievable for families who might not otherwise have considered it. The story of the Patterson family's revelation on Family Feud reminds us that family is defined not by biology but by the daily choice to show up for each other, that the bonds formed through conscious commitment can be as strong as any genetic connection, and that sharing our authentic stories can create ripple effects of positive change that extend far beyond what we can immediately see or measure. Their unexpected moment in the spotlight demonstrated that vulnerability and honesty about non-traditional family structures could challenge assumptions, inspire action, and ultimately improve the lives of thousands of children who deserved the same unconditional love and permanent belonging that every child needs to thrive. If this story resonated with you and reminded you that family comes in many beautiful forms, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these powerful moments because they challenge us to expand our understanding of what family means and inspire us to recognize that love and commitment matter more than genetics in creating lasting bonds. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that adoption is not a second choice path to family, but a legitimate and beautiful way to build connections that matter. Remember that every child deserves a family, that adoptive parents are real parents in every meaningful sense, and that the choice to love a child who needs you is one of the most profound acts of courage and compassion any person can make.